ignored by state investigators. A card in Vicky Cushman's Rolodex. On it was the name of old flame Todd Berry. Berry had not been followed up on before and still wasn't now. Instead, the state made Officer Scott Hornoff the focus of their investigation. What state officials learned about Hornoff's activities on the night of the murder raised suspicions. Hornoff had been at a party with other police officers that night. He had left the party late in the evening, but then returned over an hour later.
There were statements that were made that he was at this party that night. He left the party, he came back, he was a different person when he came back, and never talked about where he was.
State detectives saw this missing hour as a possible window of opportunity for the murder. On November 13th, 1992, after the state police investigation had gone on for a year, detectives requested an interview with Hornoff for the first time. His attorney, Joel Chase, was unable to make the meeting.
And he said, well, I'm going to go on my own then because I didn't do anything wrong and I'm simply going to tell the truth. Major mistake.
Early in the interview, Hornoff had no problems. He calmly recounted the details of his extramarital affair with Vicky Cushman.
Scott, would you tell me how you first met Vicky Cushman?
I met Vicky Cushman through scuba diving. She was an employee at the Alpine Dive Shop.
Hornoff told investigators that Cushman had propositioned him at a restaurant and then would call him at work to arrange meetings.
She would invite me to her apartment to go up and have iced tea or lemonade.
And did you accept her invitation?
Yes, I did.
Hornoff explained that when he decided to break off the affair, Vicky, he thought, took the news well.
Did she ever get upset with that?
I could see that she was a little sad, but she wasn't...
Was she crying?
No.
At that point, the interview shifted, and Hornoff's trouble began. Detectives questioned Hornoff extensively about the party he had been to the night of Vicky Cushman's murder.
Do you recall that particular party?
Yes, I do.
It's very clear in your mind?
Parts of it are clear. It happened 3 years ago, but...
Detectives were especially interested in when Hornoff and his brother left the party.
I'd say it was between, I'm only guessing, 10 or 11 o'clock. I'd say somewhere close to 11.
Hornoff said his brother had dropped him off at his house, but that he had immediately driven himself back to the party to retrieve some tapes he had left behind.
I was only there at the most maybe 10 or 15 minutes tops.
Hornoff said he was home before 1 a.m., yet his memory of the night 3 years earlier wasn't always clear.
They told me to take my best guesses when I didn't remember something. And even though I was familiar with being a cop and with investigations, I went along with it and I took my best guesses.
Those guesses would later come back to haunt Hornoff. His times didn't match those of other witnesses. They were contradicted by other guests at the party. Even Hornoff's wife had given information the day after the murder that contradicted him. Hornoff was called in for a second interview 4 months later to try to clear up these inconsistencies.
I still had faith that the state police were going to eliminate me as a suspect. I said, anything you want to do it.
But when he was confronted with the contradictions, investigators say Hornoff's reaction was highly suspicious. The second interview was not taped. But the police report said, quote, Scott became flushed and morose. It quoted Hornoff saying, I'm going to get indicted and lose my wife and kids. Hornoff, they added, never did answer their questions.
I just took it for granted that they were going to see that I was innocent and that I wasn't a suspect, or at least a good, viable suspect. I regret a lot of my choices back then as far as going down there without an attorney. I regret going at all.
In the spring of 1996, police officer Scott Hornoff was facing trial in Providence, Rhode Island for the 7-year-old murder of Vicky Cushman. Hornoff needed allies, and for that reason, finally confessed to his wife Rhonda about his infidelity with the murdered woman.
I met her outside of her work, and I said, I'm going to lose you one of two ways. Either you're going to leave me because I was unfaithful to you, or I'm going to be taken away for something I didn't do.
His wife told him she would stick by him and was willing to look past his indiscretions. Whether a jury would do the same was not clear. Hornoff's trial began on May 15, 1996. Prosecutors had no physical evidence linking Hornoff to the murder. The case was built almost exclusively on witness recollections. Those memories were often cloudy.
This trial's taking place, 7 years after the murder.
The long passage of time makes the case harder to prosecute because people's memories just aren't as good.
Yet the trial would hinge on those memories. Attempting to show that Hornoff had had an opportunity to commit the crime, the state called officers who attended a police party with Hornoff the night Vicky Cushman was killed.
They got into excruciating detail, rightly so, about the events that happened that night, the night of the murder. That he went to the party, he came back, he looked dazed, and all of that.
Hornoff's wife Rhonda, now 6 months pregnant with their third child, and his brother David were also called to testify. But they all disagreed about when Hornoff had arrived at the party, when he had left the party, and when he had finally come home for the night.
Very conflictual type of testimony from a lot of different sources. It did sort of bring a turning point to that trial for me.
If the people closest to Scott Hornoff couldn't get their story right, got to be some hint of guilt there.
Jurors also did not like what they learned about Scott Hornoff's personality. In his grand jury testimony, which was entered into evidence, Hornoff was questioned about Vicky Cushman and replied, "I'd had affairs before her and after her. It was just one of those things."
Listening to the affairs, the deception, the sort of casualness of how Scott treated women, naturally I reacted to that.
I made it very clear that he was married and had certain affairs and relationships with other women during his marriage, and that they weren't going to like him very much because of that. But they were obligated to find him guilty or not guilty based strictly on the evidence and the law as the judge showed them they should be applying it.
Defense attorney Joel Chase, for his part, maintained that the state simply wasn't proving its case. For example, he pointed to the only piece of prosecution evidence which provided a motive for the murder, a letter to Hornoff found in Cushman's apartment.
It was sealed. There's no evidence that he had ever seen it or knew its contents or its existence.
And its substance? Vicky had written, "You admitted that things were not on an even keel at home. It sounds to me that making love with me won't make matters worse."
Frankly, it's not a threatening letter. It doesn't say, either continue this encounter with me or I'm going to tell your wife. It just says they're not mutually exclusive.
In the end, Hornoff's attorney was confident that the state's evidence simply didn't add up. He strongly recommended his client not take the stand. Hornoff grudgingly agreed.
All I wanted to do was stand on top of the desk and say, can't you just look at the facts? Can't you use your God-given common sense and see that this isn't true?
But some jurors were troubled by this decision.
I just would have liked to have heard from him what his side of the story was.
They just said, we want to hear from you. Why aren't you getting up if you're innocent and shouting it from the rooftops?
On June 17, 1996, the case went to the jury.
Could he have done it? Yeah. Could he have not done it? Possibly. But having sat through 6 weeks of that trial, I came away with a very gnawing feeling that they didn't prove their case.
Jurors thought otherwise. After 3 days of deliberation, they took a vote.
You could hear a pin drop in that room, and one by one, guilty, first degree, guilty, first degree. And it was, when we got all around the table, it was like, my God, you know, this is our decision.
That afternoon, court was reconvened for the verdict, and Scott Hornoff was brought in.
Normally, if it's a not guilty verdict, the sheriff won't stay right next to you. There's no reason to. But he wouldn't leave my side, so that wasn't a good sign.
The verdict was read aloud. Guilty of murder in the first degree.
All hell broke loose. People were screaming, people were yelling. I remember looking over at Scott, and I think he was just blank.
And I was led downstairs to the courthouse cell block. They took my tie, my belt, my shoelaces. They strip searched me. It was pretty humiliating, and I was in shock.
As Hornoff was about to be transported to the Rhode Island State Prison, he was allowed to meet with his attorney. He had one question.
I asked him how long it would take for an appeal, and he said maybe a year. And I said, I don't know if I can do a year.
The 1989 beating death of Vicky Cushman in Warwick, Rhode Island, had sent Scott Hornoff to prison for life. By 2002, he'd been there for 6 years. For Hornoff, being a former cop made prison especially rough.
I was placed into protective custody being a police officer. So I was in with other police officers and guards, convicted child molesters, guys in gangs, mob informants, and so forth.
His troubled marriage had not survived his time behind bars. Hornoff and his wife Rhonda had divorced 3 years before. From the beginning, Hornoff had maintained his innocence. But no one with any power was listening. His appeals had repeatedly been denied.
We kept fighting, and we kept believing that something was going to free me. It was just very frustrating. Every step of the judicial system failed.
But a break in the case would come from a completely unexpected source. Only 4 miles from Hornoff's prison lived the one man who could truly exonerate him. His name was Todd Berry. Berry was a 45-year-old carpenter with a wife and 2 children. He'd had no prior scrapes with the law. But on October 28, 2002, he called a family friend who was also an attorney with urgent business.
7 o'clock on a Monday morning, I got a call at my home, and it was Todd. And he explained to me that he had something that he wanted to get off his chest.